Thank you very much for coming to our talk. Robert and I have been researching NDEs since 2005. We're going to present the evidence we have compiled for the conclusion that there is no death, that we do not die with the death of the body. You can read more about our research at our website, selfconsciousmind.com. You can visit our YouTube channel by clicking on the icon on the homepage. What is the human experience of dying? Those human beings who have been close to death and experienced the first stages of the dying process and returned, called near-death experiencers, provide the best evidence. Near-death experiences are a core experience. They are consistent for people of all ages and across many cultures. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide have had an NDE. The characteristic elements of the experience define an NDE. For example, there is a profound sense of peace and freedom from pain. There is a feeling of separation from the body, generally floating above one's physical body. Seeing events in the physical realm beyond normal physical sight that are later verified as accurate, called veridical perceptions. Entering a beautiful heavenly realm or a dark velvety void, feeling it is one's true home, called the transmaterial phase of the NDE. Encountering deceased relatives or spiritual beings, including a being of light. Reviewing the events of one's life, a life review. Choosing to return to earthly life, or being told to return to the body. Can NDEs be studied scientifically? Yes. The elements in NDEs are remarkably consistent and can be regarded as objectively real. Individually, the elements may appear to be subjective. Collectively, across many millions of NDErs, they reflect a common objective reality witnessed and shared by many NDErs. Therefore, NDEs provide valid data for scientific study. So, regarding the quality of evidence from NDEs and related phenomena, NDErs are credible eyewitnesses to their experiences. Millions of NDErs report the same experience with the same characteristics. Similar first-person testimony from multiple NDErs provides strong objective evidence. Sometimes there's independent cooperation from other credible witnesses of the phenomenon. Multiple lines of evidence from NDEs and other death-related experiences build a consistent, coherent picture.
How can we check that the experiences in an NDE are real? We can check cases of veridical perceptions where the NDEr's perceptions of the physical events match what actually happened and are verified as completely accurate. Here is the case of Dr. Lloyd Rudy's patient. Cardiac surgeon Lloyd Rudy operated on a patient to replace a heart valve. After the surgery and after numerous failed attempts to wean him off the heart-lung machine, the patient was declared dead. The life-sustaining machines were turned off, except for the heart echo probe and other monitoring instruments. The patient had no heartbeat, no blood pressure, and no respiration for at least 20 minutes. His eyes remained taped shut, and his wife was told that he had died. During this time, Rudy and assistant surgeon Roberto Cattaneo stood in the OR doorway in their shirt sleeves, discussing how they might have done the procedure differently. The patient's heart spontaneously started beating again and developing blood pressure. Rudy called the surgical team back, and they eventually resuscitated the patient, who remained in a coma for 2 days in the ICU. The patient recovered with no neurological deficit and later reported having an NDE and floating above the scene in the OR. He recounted several accurate veridical perceptions during this time. In particular, he reported seeing the 2 surgeons standing and talking in the OR doorway in their shirt sleeves with their arms folded, and seeing Post-it notes, which were phone messages, stuck together in a chain on a computer screen, which had not been there at the start of the operation. Now, a skeptic can object that Dr. Rudy's patient was in the same room as the 2 surgeons and may have had some perceptions from residual brain function, even after 20 minutes of no heartbeat, even with his eyes taped shut. However, there are other numerous cases in which the NDEr perceives unusual objects and events at a distance from their body. Take the following case. Critical care physician Lauren Belge's patient Howard suffered a cardiac arrest while recovering from surgery in the ICU. Howard was completely unconscious, but was resuscitated by several defibrillation shocks and was put on a ventilator. Howard later reported that he shot out of the top of his head. He says, "I'm looking down on my body and it feels like I'm bobbing and bouncing against the ceiling." With the thought that maybe he was to go somewhere, he says, "I felt myself rising up through the ceiling, and it was like I was going through the structure of the building. I could feel the different densities of passing through insulation. I saw wiring, some pipes, and then I was in this other room. It looked like a hospital, but it was very quiet, like there was no one there. There were people in beds that looked like mannequins, and they had IVs hooked up to them, but they didn't look real. In the center was an open area that looked like a collection of workstations with computers." Now, right above his ICU room is a nurse training center with medical mannequins on some of the beds, and in the center, a collection of workspaces with computers. Dr. Belge and the attending nurse were astonished at the accuracy of Howard's description, and because the presence of the nurse training center was not generally known, not even by non-nursing staff. Howard remained under sedation for several days after the resuscitation. When he was finally weaned off the ventilator, he was able to talk and immediately related his experiences. He related a number of additional veridical details of the resuscitation. These cases mean that the experiences in an NDE, the perceptions of the physical realm, are real. These perceptions are called veridical because they are accurate and have been verified by a credible third party. See, the self does not die for more than 65 of these cases, including Lloyd Rudy's patient, case 311, and Howard, case 333. The veridical perceptions occur from the NDEr's reported vantage point outside the physical body, generally from above, near the ceiling. The objects or events perceived are unusual or idiosyncratic. Lloyd Rudy's patient seeing the 2 surgeons in their shirt sleeves in the OR doorway, and Howard seeing the nurse training center. The NDEr's description is frequently a detailed, purely visual event or an unusual object. The events or objects are unlikely to be guessed or inferred from the circumstances. Often, the veridical perceptions are immediately disclosed by the NDEr, such that they could not have been told to the NDEr by someone else, or a memory that the NDEr subconsciously fabricated from information acquired later. The timing of specific idiosyncratic events establishes what the NDEr's level of brain function was. In some cases, like cardiac arrest, it is clear that the perceptions could not have been produced by the brain. This strongly suggests that the NDEr's mind or consciousness has somehow separated from the body during the NDE and is in a different location. The fact that NDErs have accurate perceptions without the mediation of the brain suggests that the mind is operating independent of the body. Here is the evidence that the mind is a separate entity, independent of the body. First, during an NDE, the mind functions as a cohesive unit. The NDEr experiences that their entire being has separated from the body and that all aspects of their mind or self are still consciously present to them throughout their NDE. Their senses, thoughts, feelings, intentions, and memory. There is a continuity of consciousness throughout the separation and return, even in cases of bouncing repeatedly in and out of the body like a ping pong ball. The contrast of the out-of-body mind to the mind in ordinary consciousness includes the loss of physical pain and disabilities, enhanced visual perceptions and memory formation, and a heightened sense of reality. Some NDErs exclaim, "That physical body wasn't me." In effect, the separate mind is the essence of the person. These experiences strongly suggest that a person's mind is a separate entity that is independent of the body.
Is the separate mind entity objectively real? We can take a subjective phenomenon to be objectively real if it can be observed by others. There are several lines of evidence from NDEs that the non-material mind is objectively real. There are a number of cases in which the NDEr can be seen by others. They can be seen by animals. Jerry Casebolt experienced an NDE at age 7. He died during surgery and left his body. Jerry floated over a school playground located just north of the hospital. There were lots of children playing outside there. A German Shepherd dog was playing with the children. Jerry floated down to investigate. The dog sensed his presence and playfully barked at him. Jerry positioned himself just a few inches above where the dog could jump, teasing the animal by staying just out of reach. The dog barked and jumped up at him, wagging his tail excitedly, barking and repeatedly jumping crazily up at him. Jerry told us that he and the dog, quote, looked into each other's eyes. I was moving up, down to the sides. We moved together like a dance. NDErs can be seen by other people. An apparitional NDE is a particular event in an NDE in which the out-of-body NDEr visits and communicates in some way with a living person, and both accounts of the encounter are subsequently verified to be consistent with one another. In 1989, Olga Gerhardt underwent heart transplant surgery. All of her family came to the hospital to await the outcome, except her son-in-law, who could not be at the hospital. The heart transplant was successful, but at 2:15 a.m., her new heart stopped beating, and it took 4 hours to resuscitate her heart, and then longer still for her to recover consciousness. The son-in-law was sleeping at home. He awoke at exactly 2:15 a.m. Standing at his bedside was Olga. Thinking the surgery had been postponed, he asked her how she was. She replied, "I am fine. I'm going to be all right. There's nothing for any of you to worry about." She asked him to tell her daughter, his wife, and then she disappeared. The son-in-law wrote down the time and exactly what was said, and then went back to sleep. When Olga regained consciousness, her first words were, "Did you get the message?" Olga later reported that she had left her body and had tried but was unable to communicate with the family members who were all asleep in the hospital waiting room. So she went to the son-in-law, with whom she succeeded in communicating. This is case 7.3 in the self does not die. NDErs can also be seen by other NDErs. There are cases of simultaneous NDEs, in which the NDErs could see and interact with one another. In the case of the 20-person hotshot firefighting team, the group was caught by shifting winds. They were quickly engulfed in flames, and each had an NDE. They saw each other standing over their bodies in the air. Each NDEr's out-of-body form was objectively visible to the other NDErs. The objective corroboration by others of the NDEr's out-of-body form demonstrates that the NDEr mind entity is a real thing, a real being. The separate mind entity really exists.
The evidence from NDEs so far shows 3 things. That the mind can separate from and operate independently of the body. That a person's mind is a separate entity in itself, and that a person's mind entity is a real thing, a real being. Given this evidence, we propose the mind entity hypothesis. The human being consists of a non-material mind that is intimately integrated with the physical body. The mind entity is the seat of consciousness of the person. All cognitive faculties, perception, thinking, feeling, volition, memory, and self-awareness reside in the non-material mind, not in the brain. For in-body consciousness, the mind entity interacts energetically with the brain's electrical activity to establish consciousness and support the mind's cognitive faculties. Ordinarily, the mind is completely dependent on the brain's electrical activity for consciousness. For the out-of-body state in an NDE, the mind entity separates from the body and operates independent of the brain. For this theory to work, there must be some form of energetic interaction between the mind and the brain, and some plausible mechanism of interaction. How could a non-material mind interact with the material brain to achieve consciousness? There is strong evidence that the out-of-body mind interacts with physical processes such as light, sound waves in the air, and solid matter, giving rise to subjective sensations and accurate veridical perceptions in the physical realm. And there is evidence of a new force involved in mind-matter interactions, a subtle push-pull force when the out-of-body mind entity passes through solid matter, giving the sensation of resistance or increased density to the NDEr. Recall that NDEr Howard felt different densities passing through the layers of insulation. This is similar to passing one's hand through water. And there is evidence that when NDErs interact with another person's body, the mind can interact specifically with neural electrical processes, both sensing and triggering neural electrical activity. Here is a plausible mechanism for mind-brain interaction. In our theory, the physical interface between the non-material mind and the brain is in the gray matter. The interface is specifically in the apical dendrites in the outermost 2 to 3 millimeters of the cortex. There is a two-way causal interaction between the non-material mind and brain neurons. The mind senses neural action potentials through their back propagation in the apical dendrites. And the mind opens ion channels in the dendrites to trigger action potentials. The neural electrical activity brings perceptions and thoughts to awareness in the mind. And mental intentions trigger electrical activity which activates motor actions.
Most philosophers and scientists reject dualist theories like ours because they think it's impossible for a non-material mind to interact with a physical brain. They consider consciousness purely the result of brain processes. We address the philosophical objections to interactionist dualism. First, there is strong evidence that the out-of-body mind interacts with physical processes, giving rise to phenomenal perceptions in the NDEr's mind. And there is evidence that a subtle, previously unrecognized two-way force is involved in mind-matter interactions. There are three specific philosophical challenges to interactionist dualism. First, taking the mind to be a thing is a category error because the mind is simply the collection of a person's dispositions and capacities resulting from brain activity. So minds are in a different category from physical objects like brains. However, the non-material mind is actually in the same category as physical objects because the mind is an objectively real thing that unites with the brain and body. Secondly, the causal pairing problem of how a non-material mind existing outside physical space can causally interact with a physical object like a brain. Any causal interaction must occur in spatial relation to the physical object. In our view, the non-material mind is a three-dimensional object in physical space which merges and pairs with the physical brain. The mind and brain are located in intimate spatial relation to one another and exert direct causal interactions with each other. Third, the causal closure of the physical, stating that all physical effects have only physical causes. In our theory, the mind is non-material, yet interacts with physical processes and thus takes part in physical causation. The mind interfaces with the brain at specific points of contact at the surface of the cortex. Many skeptics assert that NDE phenomena are merely the states of a dying brain, which can explain all of the main elements: feelings of peace, feeling separated from the body, passing through a tunnel, seeing a bright light, etc. A number of physiological and neurological factors are generally cited in these explanations of NDEs, such as altered blood gas levels, neurochemical factors, and seizures. However, none of these factors alone or in combination is adequate to explain NDEs because the reported experiences bear only slight resemblance to NDEs. Many NDEs occur under conditions without the suggested factor and/or in cases where the physiological or neurological factor is present. NDEs are not reported in even a large percent of cases. Most skeptics focus on only one or two aspects of an NDE account in order to explain away that account. The skeptic then claims that NDEs have now been fully explained in purely physical terms. They say that the NDEr actually got their information just before losing consciousness. For example, overhearing the nurses discussing something, or some time after regaining consciousness. For example, piecing together information from different sources afterward to subconsciously construct their experiences. These explanations are ad hoc. They apply only to a specific NDE, but the proponents fail to explain all anomalous aspects of the NDE. They fail to validate their explanation of the NDE with the facts of the case, and they fail to develop general explanations that can be applied to different NDEs with similar characteristics. Reliance on ad hoc hypotheses to explain NDEs indicates that the physicalist theory lacks coherence.
NDEs were first studied in cases in which the person was close to death. However, NDEs also occur in people who are not near death nor in physical distress. In fact, these experiences can also occur in non-life-threatening situations, such as during sleep or when fainting, in meditation, with drug or alcohol use, or even spontaneously. NDEs cannot be distinguished whether the person was perfectly healthy or in cardiac arrest. There is no significant difference on the NDE scale in either the NDE content or intensity between the near-death-like experiences and so-called real NDEs. This suggests there is a common proximate or immediate cause for all NDEs. If that's the case, there must be some unifying factor that is common in all cases of NDEs and near-death-like experiences. Now, we know that nearly 80% of NDErs report feeling separated from their body. So we propose that the common proximate cause of all NDEs is, in fact, the separation of the mind from the physical body. Various physiological and psychological conditions, or no apparent condition, can trigger the separation of the person's conscious mind from the body. So explanations of specific physiological or neurological factors fail, considering there is a common proximate cause for all NDEs. Here is a summary of the NDE evidence that the mind is a separate entity. First, a person's mind or consciousness can separate from the physical body and operate independent of it. The separate mind embodies all of the person's cognitive functions. It is the essence of the person. The separate mind itself is an objectively real thing, a real being. Our mind entity hypothesis is a plausible picture of the human being. And there is a plausible mechanism for two-way causal interactions between the non-material mind and the brain. The mind entity theory addresses the main philosophical objections to dualism. And other explanations of NDEs fail. They do not apply to all NDEs with a comprehensive explanation of all aspects of the core experience. But the question remains, is there survival of physical death?
Encountering deceased persons is an important element in NDEs. Nearly half of NDErs report seeing or sensing the presence of someone who had died earlier. The NDEr generally recognizes the deceased loved one for who they are. The decedents in turn recognize and acknowledge the NDEr. The loved one or acquaintance may give the NDEr a message to bring back to someone still living. Typically, the decedent tells the NDEr, "It's not your time, you must go back." Skeptics argue that whereas NDErs may have been near to death, they did not actually die, they came back. So NDEs themselves are not evidence of survival. Skeptics say that any encounters with deceased loved ones are actually due to the NDEr's expectation of meeting deceased loved ones because they realize they have died, or the NDEr's wishful thinking or pure imagination. Any veridical information received from the deceased person is just a lucky guess. So the skeptics conclude that NDEs do not provide credible evidence of survival of physical death. There are two types of cases of encountering deceased loved ones that address these objections. The first type is encountering persons known to the NDEr, but who were not known to have died. If the NDEr recognizes the deceased person and receives veridical information during the encounter that they did not know at the time, but is later verified, this is strong objective evidence that the decedent was actually the person known to the NDEr. Here is the case of Jack Bybee and nurse Anita. At 26, NDEr Jack Bybee was hospitalized with severe pneumonia and was cared for by a nurse named Anita. While Anita was away on the weekend to celebrate her 21st birthday, Jack had his NDE. He recounts, "In my NDE, I met nurse Anita on the other side." "What are you doing here, Anita?" I asked. "Why, Jack, I've come to fluff up your pillows, of course, and to see that you are all right. But Jack, you must return, go back. Tell my parents, I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB. Tell them I love them." Then Anita was gone. When I recovered, I told a nurse what Anita had said. This girl burst into tears and fled the ward. I later learned that Anita and this nurse had been great friends. Anita had been surprised by her parents, who had presented her with a red MGB sports car. Anita had jumped into the car and in her excitement raced down the highway, hitting a concrete telephone pole. Jack continues, but I was dead when all that happened. How could I possibly know these facts? I was told by Anita in my experience. So the second type is encountering persons not known to the NDEr, but later identified. If the decedent is not known to the NDEr during the NDE, but is later verified as the person they presented themselves to be, this is another form of strong evidence that the deceased person was objectively real. Here is the case of the unknown sister Richa. A 5-year-old child contracted meningitis and fell into a coma. She relates, I died and drifted in a safe and black void where I felt no fear and no pain. I felt at home in this place. I saw a little girl of about 10 years old. I sensed that she recognized me. We hugged and then she told me, I'm your sister. I died a month after I was born. I was named after your grandmother. Our parents called me Richa for short. She kissed me and I felt her warmth and love. You must go now, she said. In a flash, I was back in my body. I opened my eyes and saw the happy and relieved looks on my parents' faces. When I told them about my experience, they initially dismissed it as a dream. I made a drawing of my angel sister who had welcomed me and repeated everything she told me. My parents confirmed that they had indeed lost a daughter called Richa. She had died of poisoning about a year before I was born. They had decided not to tell me and my brother until we were old enough to understand the meaning of life and death. What do these cases mean? Veridical communication with someone who has already died is evidence implicitly for personal survival of physical death. These cases are strong objective evidence of contact with those who have died, and strong evidence that the minds of deceased persons continue after physical death.
Skeptics can still argue that the presence of deceased persons in an NDE is not sufficient in itself. What is the evidence that the NDEr could continue on to actual physical death? Let's examine a related phenomenon, shared death experiences, SDEs. In an SDE, someone attending a dying loved one experiences the dying process along with the loved one. The geometry of the room may change. An unusual light may fill the room, or ethereal music may be heard. The SDEr may see the dying person's spirit leave the physical body. The SDEr may leave their own body and accompany the deceased person out of body. The SDEr may see deceased relatives and friends of the dying person come to escort the person to the other realm. So the SDEr becomes an objective eyewitness of the process of dying. Here is the case of Dr. Jameson and her mother. Dr. Jameson was visiting her mother when her mother had a cardiac arrest. Jameson administered CPR, but after 30 minutes realized that her mother was dead. Jameson felt herself lift out of her body. She felt that she was above her own body. She realized that she was above her own body, and the spirit of her mother was next to her. In the corner of the room, a light-filled tunnel opened up. Out of that light came people Jameson had known for years, deceased friends of her mother. Her mother had a tender reunion with her friends and drifted off into the light. The tube closed down, the light was gone, and Jameson was back in her body, standing next to her deceased mother. Dr. Jameson was perfectly healthy. She knew that her mother had died. She was a witness to the process of her mother's death and the transition into a different realm. In particular, the spirit form of her deceased mother was objectively present to her in the experience. And here is the case of Dana and Johnny. When Dana's husband Johnny was dying of lung cancer, she was with him when he died. She says, "He went right through my body, and our whole life sprang up around us and just kind of swallowed up the hospital room and everything in it in an instant. There was light all around, a bright white light that I immediately knew, and Johnny knew, was Christ. Everything we ever did was there in that light. Plus, I saw things about Johnny. I saw him with girls when he was very young. Later, I searched for them in his high school yearbook and was able to find them, just based on what I saw during the life review during his death." In this SDE, Dana and Johnny participated in a simultaneous life review of their lives. Dana saw things about Johnny's relationship with girls in high school, and she was able to validate that the girls had attended high school with him. Dana also verified experiences the two of them had together. Like Dr. Jameson, Dana was healthy and awake, but was drawn into a bright white light and interacted with Johnny's out-of-body spirit, who appeared objectively present to her. What do shared death experiences mean? The SDEer observes the decedent's transition to actual death. They directly perceive elements that commonly occur in NDEs, but from a third-person perspective. The decedent's spirit body is, therefore, the mind entity that separates from the body in an NDE. Thus, in the SDE, the decedent's conscious self survives physical death. Skeptics can still argue that SDE phenomena are merely subjective perceptions of the dying person's transition, typically due to the SDEr's wishful thinking. Is there any objective evidence that the dying person actually continues to exist after death, or do they just disappear?
There is strong evidence that the decedent continues on after death. Consider spontaneous after-death communications, ADCs. An ADC is the spontaneous direct communication from a deceased family member or friend with a living person. It can occur by sensing a presence, hearing a voice, feeling a touch, smelling a fragrance, or seeing the decedent in partial or full appearance while the witness is completely awake, while asleep, or while falling asleep or waking up. The decedent may provide veridical information about a lost insurance policy or hidden valuables, or warn the witness to avoid an airplane crash or other dangers. About 1/3 of the worldwide population has had one or more ADCs. Here is the case of Blair's father. Blair was a business executive. Her father had died from a series of strokes. She and her 5-year-old son were together in a hotel room the night before the funeral. Her son was in bed and she was sitting in a chair praying for her father. She relates, the lights in the room seemed to grow dim, and all of a sudden, there was my father. He seemed very, very solid. Though he was in his 80s when he died, now he appeared to be more like a man in his 60s. He stood there and told me, "Be strong and take care of your mother. Remember, I love you. Goodbye." It lasted only a few seconds, and then he left. My little boy, who was in bed, got up. I thought he had been asleep. He ran to me and said, "My granddaddy, my granddaddy." I said, "Your granddaddy is gone." And he said, "No, my granddaddy was right here." So my son saw him too. What do ADCs mean? They are strong evidence of the persistence of the decedent's personality, memory, and relationships with those still living. Shared ADCs, that is, encounters in which 2 or more people witness the decedent, provide objective cooperation that the decedent continues to exist after physical death and cannot be attributed to imagination or wishful thinking. Thus, ADCs indicate that the decedent's consciousness and identity continue on after death.
Here is a summary of all of the evidence. The evidence from NDEs demonstrates that the essential non-material aspect of a human being, the person's mind entity, separates from the physical body in an NDE and operates independent of the brain and body. The evidence from shared death experiences, SDEs, demonstrates that in the process of physical death, as witnessed by SDEers, the dying person's mind entity separates from the physical body and transitions to a different realm. The evidence of meeting deceased persons in NDEs, SDEs, and in after-death communications, ADCs, demonstrates that the decedents are objectively real because they are observed at times simultaneously by multiple witnesses and at times provide veridical information previously unknown to the witnesses. Credible veridical communication with someone who has already died is evidence implicitly for personal survival of physical death. Based on the evidence from these phenomena, taken as a whole, a person's essential self or mind separates from the physical body at death, transitions to a different realm, and survives the death of the physical body. On the question of the survival of physical death, then, our conclusion is that the self does not die. The most important shift for all of humanity will be to accept that the human being is an eternal spiritual being clothed in a physical body. There is no need to fear death because our essential being does not die with the death of the body. There is no death. When people lose the fear of death, their whole perspective changes. They experience an inner peace and greater appreciation for life. For them, life has meaning and purpose. NDErs are less judgmental and more loving than before their NDE. They are less self-centered, more compassionate, more understanding of others. They are less materialistic and more altruistic, with an increased concern for others. And they are less competitive and more cooperative. You don't need to have an NDE in order to make these changes yourself inwardly. Thank you very much for your attention.